Section 39 of the Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Annie Mars. The Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 4. Translated by Jonathan Scott. Section 39. Story of Inz al-Wujjood and Weird al-Ikmaun, daughter of Ibrahim, vizier to Sultan Shamikh. Many ages past there was a powerful sultan who had a vizier named Ibrahim, and this master had a daughter, the most beautiful of her sex and accomplished of her age, so that she became distinguished by the appellation of Weird al-Ikmaun, or the rose among flowers. It was the custom of the Sultan Shamikh to hold annually a general assembly of all the nobles of his kingdom and the persons eminent for science or the arts, during which they were magnificently entertained at the royal expense. The former displayed their prowess in martial exercises before the sovereign, and the latter in the productions of their genius and skill, when valuable prizes were bestowed upon the arbitration of the appointed judges on those who deserved them. On one of the days of this festival, the vizier's daughter, from a latticed balcony of the palace in which she sat to view the sport, was so struck by the manly figure and agility of a young nobleman named Inz al-Wujjood, or the perfection of human nature, that love took possession of her mind. She pointed him out to a female confidant, and gave her a letter to convey to the object of her affections. The young nobleman, who had heard her praises, was enraptured by his good fortune, and the next day, having obtained as full a sight of her beauties as could be had through the golden wires of the balcony, retired, overcome by love. Letters now passed daily and almost hourly between them, and they were impatient for a meeting, which was at length planned, but the note fixing the place and time was unfortunately dropped by the confidant and carried to the vizier, who, alarmed for the honour of his family, sent his daughter the same night to a far distant castle belonging to himself, and situated on an island in a vast lake, surrounded by mountainous deserts thinly inhabited. The unfortunate lady was obliged to submit to her fate, but before her departure contrived to write on the outside of her balcony the following words: "They are carrying me off, but I know not where." In the morning, her lover, repairing as usual in the hopes of seeing his mistress in the balcony, read the unwelcome intelligence, which for a time deprived him of his senses. When he somewhat recovered, he resolved to leave the court, though then the chief favourite of the Sultan, and go in search of his beloved. Having put on the habit of a wandering devotee, he on the following evening quitted the city, and recommending himself to Providence, set out, but knew not whither. Many weeks did he travel, but he could find no traces of his beloved object, when suddenly, passing through a thick forest, there met him a monstrous lion, from whom he thought it impossible to escape, and having uttered a prayer for the happiness of his beloved, and repeated the testimony of martyrdom, he resigned himself to his fate, and waited the spring of his expected devourer. What was his surprise when the majestic animal, instead of making him his prey, on approaching close to him, having looked compassionately in his face, licked his hands, and turning round, walked gently onwards, moving his head as if to signify the youth should follow him. Inz al-Wujjood did so, and was conducted through the forest by the lion, who, ascending a high mountain, suddenly stopped at the entrance of a cave, to which was a door of iron, and then moving his head, and once more licking the hands of his companion, the generous animal left him and retired back to the woods. The youth now went to the cave, and having knocked at the door, it was opened by a venerable hermit, who bade him welcome, brought him warm water to wash his feet, and set before him refreshments of various kinds. When he had eaten, he inquired the cause of his coming to such a desolate country, and Inz al-Wujjood having related his adventures, the old man exclaimed, "Thou art a favourite of heaven, or the lion would have devoured thee. Despair not, therefore, of success, for my mind presages that thou wilt be happy, nor shalt thou want my assistance." Inz al-Wujjood having thanked him for his hospitality and generous offers, the hermit informed him that for nearly 20 years past he had not beheld a human face till a few days prior to his coming, when wandering over the mountains he had seen an encampment on the margin of the great lake below, in which appeared a crowd of men and women, some very richly habited, part of whom had embarked on board a stately yacht, and the remainder having taken leave of them, struck their tents and returned by the road they had came. Most probably, said the hermit, the yacht may have conveyed thy mistress to the castle which stands on an island in the middle of the lake, and if so, thou shalt soon be safely landed. For the rest, Providence must be thy guide. I will this night remember thee in my prayers, and meditate on what can be done for thy benefit. Having said this, the hermit conducted the wanderer to a chamber, and left him to his repose. The beautiful Wujjood al-Ikmaun during this time remained overwhelmed with uneasiness in her confinement, and it was in vain that her attendants tried to amuse her. She wandered melancholy through the magnificent gardens of the castle, the groves of which were filled with every variety of birds, whose harmony was delightful, but the soft cooing of the turtle dove and the plaintive note of the lovelorn nightingale alone caught her attention. To these she would listen for hours together, reclined on a mossy bank, and fancy their pensive strains the language of her beloved. Such was her daily employment, nor would she quit the garden till forced by her attendants to take shelter from the falling dews of night. We now return to her lover. Fatigue and the consoling assurance of the friendly hermit had greatly composed the mind of Inz al-Wujjood, who enjoyed a refreshing sleep. Nor did he awake till the sun was mounted high in the heavens, when he joined his venerable host in his devotions, after which they partook in a repast of bread, milk, and fresh fruits. This ended, the old man requested him to fetch from the forest a bundle of the filaments of palm bark, which when brought to him he plaited into a shape resembling a little boat, and giving it to Inz al-Wujjood, said, "Repair to the lake, and put this into the water, when it will become instantly large enough to hold thee. Then embark in it, and trust to heaven for the rest. Farewell." Inz al-Wujjood, having taken leave of his venerable friend the hermit, with many thanks, did as he had been commanded, and soon arrived on the margin of the lake, into which he launched his little vessel, when to his great surprise it instantaneously became a handsome boat with the sails set. He got into it, and a fair wind springing up was soon out of sight of land. For some days he was wafted over the deep, but at length the shore of an island appeared, on which he landed and made his boat fast to the trunk of a large tree. He then walked into the country, and found it beautifully interspersed with green meadows, clear streams, and shady groves of bending fruit trees, on the branches of which all sorts of birds were warbling in their different strains. Having refreshed himself with several fruits, he proceeded onwards, and at length came to the side of a superb edifice, to the gateway of which he advanced, but found it locked. For 3 days he waited in hopes of seeing some of its inhabitants, but in vain. However, on the 4th morning the gate was opened by a man, who, seeing Inz al-Wujjood, advanced towards him, and inquired who he was, whence he came, and what was his reason for waiting at the gate. "I am of Ispahan," replied Inz al-Wujjood, "and was shipwrecked in a trading voyage upon this coast, to the shore of which I alone of all my companions had the good fortune to escape." Upon hearing this, the man burst into tears, embraced him, and said, "May God preserve thee from future calamities. I am also a native of Ispahan, where also dwelt my cousin, whom I dearly loved, and by whom I was beloved. At this happy period of my youth, a nation stronger than ours made war against us, overcame us, and among other captives forced me from my country, after which they sold me as a slave to my present master. But come, my dear countryman, enter the palace and repose thyself in my apartment, where we shall endeavour to console each other under our misfortunes, till Providence shall restore us to our homes." Inz al-Wujjood gladly accepted such a friendly invitation, and on entering the court beheld a lofty and wide-spreading tree, from the branches of which were suspended several golden cages, each inhabited by a beautiful bird, and each striving to revile the other in melody, as if in welcome of his approach. He inquired of his host to whom the splendid edifice belonged, and was informed to the vizier of Sultan Shamik, who, to secure his daughter from the vicissitudes of fortune, had lodged her here, and only visited her annually to inquire after her health, and bring her the necessary supplies for her convenience and the support of her attendants in the castle. Upon hearing the above circumstances, Inz al Wujjood was nearly overcome with ecstasy, but restraining his feelings, exclaimed to himself, "At length I have reached the abode of my beloved, and may hope for success," which was yet, however, afar off. His charming mistress, little thinking that her lover was so near, and weary of absence and the solitude of her abode, had that very evening resolved to escape from confinement. In the darkness of the night she accordingly let herself down from the battlements by a silken rope, which she had twisted from the slips of various robes, and reached the ground unhurt. With haste she fled towards the seashore, where she perceived a fishing boat, the owner of which, though at first alarmed, supposing her, from her dazzling appearance, for she was covered with jewels, to be an ensnaring genie, at length, on her assurances that she was really a woman, admitted her into his vessel. She thanked him for his kindness, which she rewarded by the gift of many rich jewels, and requested to be conveyed across the lake. The fisherman hoisted the sail, and for some hours the wind was prosperous. But now a heavy tempest arose, which tossed them constantly in imminent danger for 3 days, and drove them far from their intended course. At length the gale subsided, the sea became assuaged, and land appeared. As they approached the shore, a stately city rose to their view, the buildings of which seemed unusually magnificent. Under the terrace of the Sultan's palace they safely at last cast anchor, and it chanced that the prince, who was named Dara, was then sitting with his daughter in the balcony to enjoy the fresh sea breeze, and the view of the extensive harbour crowded with the vessels of every country. Perceiving the boat, the Sultan commanded his officers to bring the master and his crew to the presence. Great was his surprise at the introduction of the beautiful Weird al Ikmaun. From her rich dress, dignified air, and demeanour, he had concluded her to be of superior rank, and having seated her near his daughter, he graciously requested to be informed of the name of her country, and the cause of her having travelled to his capital, to which she replied in eloquent language, giving a summary detail of all her adventures. The Sultan consoled her by encouraging assurances of his protection, promised to exert his authority to the effect of a union with her beloved, and immediately dispatched his vizier with costly presents to the Sultan of Shamik, requesting him to send Inz al Wujjood to his court. The vizier, after a prosperous voyage, having reached the capital of the Sultan Shamik, presented his offerings, and made known the request of his master. To which the Sultan replied that nearly a year had elapsed since Inz al Wujjood had, to his great regret, absented himself from his court, nor had any tidings been obtained of the place of his retirement, but that he would order his vizier to accompany the ambassador in search of his retreat, being willing to oblige his master the Sultan to the utmost of his power. Accordingly, after a repose of some days, the two viziers departed in search of Inz al Wujjood, but without knowledge where to bend their journey. At length they reached the shore of the ocean of Kunuz, on which they embarked in a hired vessel, and sailed to the mountainous island of Tukala, of which the vizier of the Sultan of Shamik gave to his companion the following account. This island was some ages back inhabited by a genie, a princess of whom became violently enamoured of a handsome young man, a son of an emir of the city of Mysore, or Cairo, whom she beheld in her flight sleeping in his father's garden in the heat of the day. She sat down by him, having gently awoke him. The youth, on looking up, to his astonishment and rapture, saw a most beautiful damsel who courted his addresses. He was not backward in offering them, and mutual protestations of love and constancy took place. After some hours of happiness, the genie princess took an affectionate leave, promising soon to visit him again, and vanished from sight. The youth remained musing on his fortunate adventure till the dews of night began to fall, when his parents, fearful of some injury, sent attendants to conduct him to their palace. But he refused to go, and talked, as it appeared to them, so incoherently concerning his beloved, that they thought him distracted, seized him roughly, and forced him homewards. His father and mother were so alarmed, it was in vain that they courted him to partake of refreshment. He was sullen and gloomy, and at length abruptly retired to his chamber, where he remained in restless anxiety all night, waiting impatiently for morning, that he might revisit the happy spot where his charmer had promised to meet him again. The two viziers now disembarked and proceeded up the island. But what was the astonishment and mortification of Ibrahim on learning, when he arrived at the palace, that his daughter had escaped, nor had the attendants heard of her since her departure, though they had repeatedly searched every quarter of the island. Perceiving among his attendants whom he had left at the palace a strange young man of pallid countenance, wasted frame, and melancholy air, the vizier inquired how he had come among them, and received the reply that he was a shipwrecked merchant of Ispahan, whom they had taken in for charity. Ibrahim now requested of the vizier of the Sultan of Dara that he would return to his master and inform him of the vain search after Inz al-Wujjood, at the same time desiring him to receive into the suite the supposed merchant as far as the city of Ispahan, which lay in his route. To this the vizier of Sultan Dara consented, and the two ministers, having taken a friendly leave of each other, separated, and departed for their several capitals. The vizier of Sultan Dara, in the course of the journey, became so pleased with the agreeable manners of the supposed merchant, that he often conversed with him familiarly, and at length the young man, emboldened by his condescending attention, ventured to inquire the cause of his travels to regions so distant from his own country. Upon which he was informed of the arrival of the beautiful Wujjood al-Ikmaun at the court of Sultan Dara, of the compassion of that sultan for her misfortune, his generous protection, and his own fruitless mission in search of her lover Inz al-Wujjood. At this happy intelligence the latter, overcome with ecstasy, could no longer contain himself, but discovered who he was, and the vizier was also overjoyed at knowing, when least expected, that he had found the despaired object of his long journey. He embraced the young man, congratulated him upon the speedy termination of his absence from his beloved, and the happy union which awaited him. He then made him an inmate of his own tents, supplied him with rich attire, and every necessary becoming the condition of a person for whose fortunes he knew his sovereign to be so highly concerned. Inz al-Wujjood, now easy in mind and renovated by the happy prospects before him, daily recovered health and strength, so that by the time of their arrival at the capital of Sultan Dara he had regained his pristine manliness and vigour. When the vizier waited upon his master, the Sultan Dara, to communicate his successful commission, the sultan commanded the youth to his presence. Inz al-Wujjood performed the usual obeisance of kissing the ground before the throne, with the graceful demeanour of one who had been used to a court. The sultan graciously returned his salutation, and commanded him to be seated, after which he requested him to relate his adventures, which he did in eloquent language, interspersing his narrative poetical quotation and extempore verses applicable to the various incidents and situations. The sultan was charmed with his story, and when he had finished his relation, sent for the cauzee and witnesses to tie the marriage knot between the happy Inz al-Wujjood and the beautiful Wujjood al-Ikmaun, at the same time dispatching a messenger to announce the celebration of the nuptials to Sultan Shamikh and Ibrahim his adviser, who were bewailing their supposed irrecoverable losses, one that of his favourite, and the latter that of his daughter. Sultan Dara detained the happy couple at his court for some time, after which he dismissed them with valuable presents to their own country, which they reached in safety, and were received with the most heartfelt rejoicings by the Sultan and the repentant vizier, who now recompensed them by his kindness for the former cruelty of his behaviour towards them, so that in favour with the Sultan and happy in their own family, the lovers henceforth enjoyed every earthly felicity, sweetened by the reflection on their past distresses, till the angel of death summoned them to submit to the final destination of mortality. End of section 39. Recording by Annie Mars.